Hey, Satanico here once again for God Loves Comics, and this is Original Artefacts Episode 9. This is fairly unique in that it's covering only one artist, two if you count inkers. The last single artist episode I did was Philippe Drouillet, and that's a good one too if you want to check it out. Anyway, let's get to JR. I always thought that when I did an Original Artefacts on John Romita Jr., I would start with one of his Daredevil pages inked by the great Al Williamson. In fact, to me, that sounded like a modern comic, and those comics actually came from the late 80s. But this art is from 2005 and is by far the most recent artwork I've ever covered in this series. However, I do hope to do an episode on JR's Daredevil eventually, with Al Williamson, of course, in tow. But when I came across these pages, the draw was that it was a rare full 23-page story of original art for sale. Although Heritage has only listed 13 of those pages, which is actually more than enough to take a look at. Usually full stories are from anthologies like 6-page offerings from EC or other Golden Age publishers. Anyway, it's worth noting that there is also a surprising gap of almost 2 decades between JR's work with Williamson, who sadly passed away in 2010, and this story, which was done in 2005. Also, while I have always been a huge fan of Al Williamson, both as a great penciler and later with the impressive last chapter of his career as an inker, I have not always been a fan of Klaus Janson. I'm well aware that Janson has long been one of the most acclaimed inkers in the medium, but I think a huge degree of that acclaim came as a result of his association with Frank Miller and the work on 2 seminal 1980s books in Daredevil and Dark Knight Returns. Personally, however, I always found Janson's inks looked a little too loose and even clumsy at times, filled with amorphous, ill-defined blacks and awkward figure drawing over Miller, for whom anatomy was never really a strong suit anyway. When Janson was essentially doing finishes from Miller's layouts, Daredevil looked noticeably worse. And while that doesn't necessarily speak as much of his inking skill as his mediocre pencils, it does suggest that he wasn't really skillful enough to elevate average work with his inks. All that said, I was surprised to see that Janson is credited as writing not only the DC Comics Guide to Inking Comics, but the Guide to Penciling Comics as well. He has also taught at SVA for 30 years, so Janson unquestionably knows a hell of a lot more about every aspect of art, and most certainly inking, than I will ever know. You could even say that I barely have an inkling. I've also seen plenty of Janson inks that I'm sure I liked, and his style has changed quite a bit over his career, so in no way am I saying that all the acclaim is unwarranted. Just that he doesn't rank among my own favorite inkers, and I rarely hear his name come up in that discussion, which again may be unfair because I don't really discuss inking with anyone else. Hell, I don't even talk to anyone. Can't you tell? The opening image on the Heritage site is not the first page of the story, and the pages are not all presented in sequential order. Heritage seems to have gone with the coolest splash page first, a reasonable strategy, and as usual, they've done a good job of picking the pages with the most visual panache. There's no question that this is an energetic and visceral page, and Romita's spotting of the heavy blacks of Elektra's costume and the backdrop make for a stunning composition. Janson's inks are also much cleaner and more refined than how I disparagingly described them prior, although where an artist like Al Williamson, typically renowned for his fine, precise line work, would have given these ninjas chunkier and more substantial folds in their shinobi shizuku, traditional outfits, Janson has gone with feathery pen lines, which are okay for allowing the spotted blacks to really pop on the originals, but get overwhelmed by the heavy-handed coloring in the printed comic book. I was curious about the coloring for this printed edition because Elektra is slicing 3 members of the hand in half in this opening horizontal panel. That would be a big leap, whether forward or backwards is up to you, from the Frank Miller Daredevil days when Miller was not allowed to show her swords, or sais if you prefer, penetrating enemies and actually coming out of their backs. So Miller's stylized workaround was only to show a tent pole of clothing that clearly implied a skewering without directly drawing it. But despite the parental advisory on this comic, instead of red blood, the bisected ninjas only emit a green cloud, and the only red are their dotted eyeballs. It's the classic disappointing trope of having waves of cannon fodder creatures rather than anything of flesh and blood. So the swords show no viscera and emit no real pain. The mindless members of the hand lose nothing really. After all, do they even have lives? Does a gaseous ninja in a robe feel anything when it's sliced in half? It mutes the point of having swinging swords and flaying adamantium claws, doesn't it? You could just as well have the usual impotent ray guns fired by bloodless stormtroopers in Disney fare. Needless to say, the starkly beautiful composition is ruined by the murky computer coloring, and where Elektra pops off the page in the first panel, in the print version she looks less visible and more stealthy than the ninjas. Fortunately, we're just talking original art here and not the absolute travesty of awful modern computer coloring and how badly even the crispest art was ruined. One other weird and almost bipolar aspect of the violence presented here is that in that last panel, Elektra is beheading two members of the hand. Of course, it doesn't come close to an EC level of graphic violence, nor certainly Lev Gleason, the publisher of violent Golden Age Daredevil, but Romita Jr. draws stubby vertebrae jutting slightly from the headless shoulders. So while on the same page Elektra sliced three ninjas in half, only to emit some green nimbus, now they possess skeletons and JR seems to have snuck in a bit of real violence, almost as a subversion. It's so tiny that it remains inoffensive and thus would fly by the eyes of prying parents, but the dichotomy of what Marvel approves is just odd. The second page on the Heritage site is actually the very last page of the story, which ends with the distinct promise of more bloodless violence to come against masses of faceless hordes. Based on this splash, you would think the Wolverine had no neck, but JR's illustration of Elektra still looks striking here. The kid does have Jazzy John's DNA after all, and she is about a head taller than Wolverine, so JR is sticking to canon. The drawing of Wolverine, despite the bulging muscles and absent neck, is very standard fare, and the page looks like nothing more than a simple and fairly rushed pinup, but it's effective enough for what's required, which given the Mark Millar script, isn't much. When Heritage features several pages in the same lot, they tend to cluster some pages together in the same image while featuring others solo. In this case, we get 3 pages together. The first is a very unremarkable opening page of the story, very basic cinematic establishing shots across horizontal panels as morning mist evaporates to reveal a city nestled in the forest. Then cut to a page where writer Mark Millar has asked JR to draw hundreds of ninjas, and JR does this with both great economy and great aplomb. What's so interesting about Romita's drawing and composition here is that where almost every such scene typically shows an army amassed and front-facing the camera, aka the reader, JR has ninjas facing in every direction, many with their backs to the camera, milling about, practicing and brandishing their swords, their axes, and their pikes, and he's drawn the swarm at the very back of the proceedings with much more detail than one would expect from an artist who has said his style is shaped by necessity and deadlines. But Romita Jr. is not just hacking this out. He's mixing it up and keeping it interesting, even if the murky coloring ultimately ruins the subtleties. On this third page, it's yet another fiesta of detailed economy. Throwing stars, nunchucks, arrows, swords, either welded by ninjas or seemingly stockpiled and waiting for action, as seen in panel 4. Romita draws a lot of lines, so the work looks detailed, and yet it also looks simple and clear. The work of a master craftsman in total control of the form. If there is one weakness, it's just that the spotting of the blacks is very sparse on this, and in fact all 3 pages here. Not sure if this is due to Romita or Jansen, but the last thing either one should want is to leave the atmosphere up to the colorist. On the next page, we get a very different splash and what looks quite like Romita's bow on Jack Kirby's property, the Eternals. This isn't an Eternal, of course, just a similar giant analog in the form of an X-Men Sentinel. But JR's version of Eternals, written by Neil Gaiman, came out only 1 year later and have many scenes reminiscent of this one. Romita continues to employ these horizontal panels that run the width of the page and delivers the needed sense of scale as a massive sentinel roasts insect-like ninjas on the ground below. As I said, cannon fodder. ROMITA sets off the composition with a pure silhouette to the far right of the panel, showing ninjas watching the attack while draped around a pillar. This is a sort of Frank Miller-esque grace note that must have looked very familiar to Klaus Janson. The next 4 pages are fairly spectacular in their imagery and the effectiveness of their storytelling. The ninjas descend upon the back of the sentinel en masse, and like ants attacking a much larger prey, they begin to sting the sentinel with their swords until it shockingly comes crashing down to the ground, no doubt squashing hundreds more of the Hand. However, the implication is clear that the Hand are cultists who will sacrifice themselves for the greater cause. Wolverine then leaps into the fray, taking out swarms of the Hand with his own clawed hands. But unlike old X-Men comics, ROMITA is allowed to show the bodies of ninjas being impaled on the claws, but ROMITA draws the claws as very thin and unimpressive. I think again to moderate the violence as Marvel tries to have its bloodless cake and eat it too. Wolverine then using a cluster of dead bodies to shield him from a hail of arrows is again something familiar from Frank Miller's Wolverine miniseries as well as his own 300 series. ROMITA spots the blacks of each panel only in Wolverine's hair and costume, further emphasizing that Wolverine is the only life that matters here and the Hand are just nameless, faceless hordes. Although I'm sure this is once again ruined by the coloring. Over the next quartet of pages, it's as if ROMITA remembered how crucial spotting blacks were to his compositions, and he again handles a massive horde of Hand warriors parted on each side as Wolverine walks in the direction of the vanishing point between them. JR and Janson empty quite a bit of ink out over these pages as we see a backshot silhouette of ninjas and what looks like a copious amount of eye makeup on Wolverine. After this lengthy buildup of panels, at least comes the big reveal as a dead-eyed Elektra emerges. Wolverine's inevitable clash with Elektra is very standard fare and thankfully only lasts a single page. JR does a good job of changing around camera angles from the back shot of Wolverine to a front shot where once again he seems to have misplaced his neck. Then we get a profile of their clash where his claws again look pitifully scrawny, and ROMITA just fills the background with a bunch of action lines. Although to be fair, manga does this incessantly, and the kids seem to like it, despite mangaka often having an army of assistants as numerous as the Hand. The bottom 2 panels feature an extreme close-up stare-down which looks terrifyingly Liefeldian, but I would never paint JR with such a soiled brush of criticism. The next page is much more effective because although it has yet more chopping up of ninjas, which I'm sure Mark Miller thought was awesome, at least the spotted blacks in each of the 4 panels makes the overall page a very attractive composition. And I won't even mention how the color probably screws it up. The last 2 pages of this sequence look as if both characters have somehow fallen into Sin City, which sounds slightly more interesting. Apparently Klaus Janson had conserved his bottle of Indian ink and now was willing to finish it off on these pages. Mark Miller also shows no shame in asking JR to now draw a few more hundred dead ninjas at the feet of his 2 bloodthirsty, or rather green goo-thirsty, heroes. At last, the final Heritage page, listed as page 23 on the originals and actually the penultimate page, has a certain 90s image sterility to it that the surroundings and backgrounds are as basic as possible and the peripheral characters rather generic. But it conveys Miller's equally generic story as needed. It's a credit to JR that you can quite easily follow the story without ever needing to read a word of Miller's dialogue, heavily influenced by middle-of-the-road 80s action movies as it is. Ultimately, I come away from these pages with a continued appreciation for JR's craft and definitely for his work ethic. I also found Janson's inks a lot sharper than was typical in much of his Bronze Age work. However, given the choice, I would much rather see JR's wilder and more impressionistic work on Daredevil, along with Al Williamson's stellar inks, or even his work on Eternals, where he does his blocky best to summon the grandeur of Jack Kirby. But this will have to do for the time being, and it is a testament to John Romita Jr.'s fine eye for composition and virile line work that these pages look much better in black and white than they do in the final color version. It's also a testament to ROMITA Jr. that they read better devoid of Mark Millar's words as well. And that's it for this all John Romita Jr. episode of Original Artifacts. Often I plan these out in advance, but just as often I stumble across some interesting page on Heritage or elsewhere. I hope you'll like, I hope you'll comment, and I definitely hope you'll subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks very much for listening, and see you next time on God Loves Comics. Goodbye.
Get into the business that his father was in.
Yeah.
And how many chances he took.
Oh, I got
I'm very lucky and very proud, because a lot of young fellas try to do what their fathers do and don't succeed. And it's a very dangerous situation.
Why do you fight me on it all the time? I don't understand it.
Well, I didn't want you to risk
you to get that much better than he is.
He says, go into
it's too late for that now, I'm afraid. Too late.
Why did you become an artist? Because I can't sing and dance, right?
And
We're going to give you a stand-up routine also, and this is only the beginning.
But don't bump.
I didn't realize you were auditioning here.
yeah.
Well, I was supposed to be...
Hey, that's good. That is really good.
I was supposed to take Tony Danza's spot, but he got there before I did.
Well, you speak too clearly.
Well, I think nothing can top that, so...
Yeah.
Unless your dad wants to add another line or so.
We've only got
make it
better.
We've only got about 50 seconds.
Do some. Give
Well,
him
they
big
can
shoulders.
go off while we're inking, right?
All right, I guess
Let them
so.
go off while we're inking. I'll just put the...
Now, is this still that Japanese technique? This is...
Yeah,
This is the this is the this is the sumo set.
Very good. Incidentally, guys, in case we get cut off because the tape runs out at some point, I just want to say now, because I don't want to end it without saying that, what an absolute delight it was having Romita Père and Romita Fille. I don't know how to say it in Italian.
That's close enough.
On the show, how proud I am of both of you, and how much I've enjoyed this, and how happy I am that you've given the world evidence of why you are definitely considered to be two of the comic book greats. And thanks a million for being here with us.
Thank you, Stan. It was a pleasure to be here.
Yes, I imagine it must have been.
That was my line.
All right, now, since I said the goodbye, you might as well keep drawing. Who knows how long.